Hi everyone, thank you for joining today, and I hope you guys are having a good morning. Thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab's free online webinar. You are currently participating in They're Not a Frill if you're using them right, how to save money and get more done using high-skilled volunteers. Questions are encouraged throughout the webinar. You may type them into the question box as they arise, and they'll be read by our moderator. Your presenter today is Kleiman. Kleiman has spent more than 30 years in the nonprofit sector and is a co-founder for the Association for Consultants to Nonprofits. I will now hand it over to you, Kelly.
Thank you. Good morning to all. As you'll hear, there's less about high-skill volunteers, particularly in this seminar, than volunteers in general, because over the years I've learned that there's no such thing as a low-skill volunteer. Very few nonprofit organizations use volunteers well. And listen, let me just advance my slides so we know what we're doing. As you see, learning objectives, participants will learn how to create projects for volunteers, how to supervise them, and how to deploy them using the Big Mac. I'm so proud of that, I can't tell you. Anyway, to return, very few nonprofit organizations use volunteers well, and I can hear all of you nodding out there. There are exceptions, of course. There are places like the Art Institute of Chicago where the docents do fabulous work, or the Chicago Architecture Foundation, and many others. But much more common is the attitude that I heard from the head of a very large charity in New York. "I wish someone would get these volunteers off my back," she said. This is very much, in my opinion, like saying it's so annoying to have to pick up these $100 bills that are falling from the sky. Because people who volunteer give more money than people who don't, and unsurprisingly, most of that money goes to the agencies where they volunteer. So volunteer workers are only a pain in the ass if you're not using them right. And that is our focus for today. Okay, what are volunteers good for? Major projects. So very few of us sit in our strategic planning sessions and think to ourselves, wow, the mission of this agency is stuffing envelopes. But that's often what we ask volunteers to do. And of course, these days, there isn't that much stuffing envelopes to do, although there are often equally boring and dismissible activities like data entry. I don't mean that data entry isn't important, but when you're working with volunteers, it's very important for them to, one, get an opportunity to use their skills, and two, understand very clearly that what they are doing contributes to the mission of the organization. And that's what I mean by major projects. Many of your organizations have things that they really think they ought to get done, but for which they don't have enough person power. And so it's important to think of volunteers not as just the word volunteer, but as the two-word title, volunteer worker. Because these are workers, and if you deploy them like workers, they will be productive like workers. Now, people have different skills. I could not develop a website if my life depended on it. So when I walked into an agency and handed the executive director my resume, she looked at it and said, "Oh, you used to be a real estate lawyer. We have this problem about real estate. We run a single room occupancy hotel, and it's not full, even though there are people sleeping on the street. Can you figure out what the problem is?" And off I went and figured out what the problem was. And I felt so valued and important and contributing that I then joined the board of directors. Now, not every volunteer is going to join the board, and you won't want them all to do so. But what happened there goes to our next slide, which is, pardon me, I'm having a hard time with my mouse, there we go, which is supervision. So some of you may actually have a volunteer coordinator. Others are places that where the executive director serves as the volunteer coordinator. So, please bear this in mind as I discuss this. Volunteer coordinators are often told that their job is to get rid of menial tasks like data entry or envelope stuffing, and or keep volunteers out of the hair of the actual workforce. This is a really, really bad assignment. But if that's your assignment, then people are going to end up, volunteer workers are going to end up doing things that don't satisfy them and simply reinforce in the minds of the staff that volunteers are a waste of space on a crowded planet. So it's important to redefine the coordinator's role or rethink the role of volunteers as a gateway to your most valuable resource. And from my standpoint, the key to that is to find projects and not tasks. Again, somebody saying, oh, I wonder why our single room occupancy hotel isn't full. I wonder why we can't update our website. I wonder why our marketing materials are so badly written, and on and on and on. So there are certainly orphan projects, ones that everybody thinks ought to be done, but nobody thinks is their job. There are projects that come out of different substantive areas at your agency. That's what I mean by aid to the overwhelmed. People who really need 5 program officers and only have 4. And it's an analogy to the use of the board of directors. When you don't say to the board of directors, at least you shouldn't, why don't you come over and stuff our envelopes? You say, what do we need to do to serve our clients better? So that's the thing that you need to think about when you're looking for projects as distinguished from tasks for your volunteer workers. So there are 2 different things that you need to think about in identifying major projects. Discrete items, I say tasks there, which is a big mistake, discrete items on which volunteers can make reasonable progress. I mean, please don't give them something that can never, ever be finished. Why don't you call all of our 83,000 donors and thank them is a bad task for volunteer workers. And real clarity about what skills are required. Don't throw somebody into reworking your website if they actually don't have the technical skills that are necessary to reworking and creating a good website. Important, which is almost as much as essential, but not quite, tasks which can be done independently. So let me ask you all to think about what projects you could use volunteers for. I mean, as I say, the best experience I ever had as a volunteer was someone who handed me a list, an executive director who handed me a list of all of the things that they needed doing. Now, some of them were completely irrelevant to me, but what that meant was that the organization had thought about how to use volunteers. The other thing you need to think about, or at least the second main thing you need to think about, is do you have the right people to supervise those particular projects? And this is where we get into the issue of not having the volunteer coordinator supervise everything. That is an unreasonable thing to ask, no matter how capable your volunteer coordinator and no matter how small your volunteer corps. It's actually better, if it's possible, to have substantive program people supervise your volunteers. When I volunteered at the ACLU of Illinois, I was supervised by the head of the Reproductive Rights Project because I was working on the Reproductive Rights Project. The job of the volunteer coordinator was to make sure I was connected properly to that person. So again, think about, scribble down what projects you could use volunteers for, and who you would ask to supervise them if you actually use them. So then the next question is how to integrate volunteers into those projects. And many of you have had the experience of saying to somebody in your organization, oh, I have a volunteer who wants to help you, and having that person roll their eyes. Oh my God, please don't stick me with a volunteer. Well, one of the best ways to handle that is to have more than one volunteer work on a project. And out of that group of volunteers, even if the group is only 3 people, you identify someone who is able to organize the project and supervise the other volunteers. Now, I understand that you might think to yourself, oh my God, this is an opportunity for somebody to be bossy and a pain in the neck. And it is true. But if you've spoken to your volunteers in any depth at all, you know the difference between people who can organize other people and people who can organize projects on the one hand, and people who just want to feel their own power on the other. So you identify a volunteer leader. And by the way, if it doesn't work out, you identify a different volunteer leader. You let them supervise other volunteers on this task. And this is key. You hold them accountable for results. So if the project is set up a phone line for your clients to call when they're in an emergency situation, you get the volunteer leader to sit down with the other volunteers and to write a timeline for making that happen with every step involved, just as you would with any other worker. And again, let me emphasize, volunteer worker. Treat them like workers and they will work like workers. And by the way, the people that they work with will treat them like workers and be less reluctant to deal with volunteers. Now, again, leadership is, a skill, and you see that prospective volunteer leaders also, no matter how many skills they have, need to have significant and predictable time to give. Look for the volunteer who says, I am prepared to treat this as a part-time job, or even I am prepared to treat this as a full-time job, though there are fewer of them. Skills pertinent to the project, except when the project is very technical. And I know I keep adverting to website development, but that's because website development is often an issue. It's often something for which agencies don't have the money, and they'd really like to find somebody who knows how to do it. If the skills are very technical, then if the project is very technical, then you need to define technical skills narrowly. But otherwise, skills pertinent to the project can be, is a good writer, or is friendly. If the project is, reach out to our top 5 donors and see what they're thinking. Interview a group of people. It's important to think of your volunteer workers as multidimensional people with multiple skills, and any one of those skills might match the project that you've identified. Now, sometimes people think that the easiest thing to do with any volunteer is to put them on the board. Well, your board of directors should be giving money, and your board of directors should be thinking about policy. And both of those things are particular interests and capabilities. So not everybody who comes to you is going to have both of those interests and capabilities. Sometimes, even if they don't have the capacity to give money, but they want to think about the issues that the board thinks about, you ask them to serve on a committee, a board committee, even if they're not board members. And that can be a reasonable thing to do. Often, though, bear in mind that the function of committee service is to kind of train people for board service. And if you're dealing with somebody who says to you right up front, listen, I'm happy to give time, but I'm not going to give any money, even though you know that ultimately they will give money, you probably don't want to spend a lot of time training them to be on the board when the board needs to give money. Now, some of you may be thinking, yeah, Cal, this is all very well, but my staff really does not want to work with volunteers. Listen, I understand it. There are a couple of things that are going on. There's resentment by people who do X for a living that other people are doing X as a hobby. I remember feeling that way as an executive director when I was dealing with a recalcitrant board of directors. Like, hey, you guys, you can sit around and say, why don't you blah, 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 but I'm the one who's working 80 hours a week. And, you know, I really don't need your input and you're being a pain in the ass. This is often the way your paid staff will feel about your volunteers. They will think, these people are not committed, these people are not trained the way I was, these people are just trying to take over my position. And so, as you see, my recommendation is that you identify the difficulties honestly. You talk to your paid staff about the fact that they are not being supplanted, that volunteer activities are supplementary to what they do and complementary to what they do, that volunteer laborers answer to them, the paid laborers, and that this can work if the staff can put their defensiveness aside. Now, listen, I know that that's a big ask, but if you speak clearly about the fact that they might feel that way, you will find staff members willing to try to overcome it. If you pretend that this is not a problem, you will have ongoing difficulties that the volunteer coordinator cannot fix. You really don't want staff members who spend all of their time thinking, what if this volunteer worker outshines me? Maybe I'll get fired and he'll get hired. And another component of making sure that volunteer workers are welcome is to make sure that the entire staff of your agency is asked to think about volunteer projects. I have consulted with agencies where when I say to the executive director, what might you use volunteers for? They kind of shrug their shoulders and say nothing, you know, we have everything we need. And then when I interview program staff, they say, oh my God, we have been trying to get X done for 5 years and it always falls to the bottom. And so if you can assign to them somebody who will do X, whether it's going through all of our old files and figuring out whether there are any current donors there, and that's not a mechanical activity, that's a thought activity. If you do that, then the staff members who identified the projects will be obviously more welcoming of the volunteer worker who does that. The other side of this, I've been emphasizing what the staff thinks and wants and knows, but item E is key. Make sure that you say to your volunteers, we are not auditioning you for a permanent job. Life is not an audition is the way I always put it. Now, in the real world, you may discover that the volunteer worker is a genius and the person whose job she could do better suddenly gets hit by a bus, and then you do actually hire the volunteer. But the general posture should be, that's not how it's going to work. You are here as a volunteer worker, and we're happy to have you. And if you go looking for a real job, we'll be happy to recommend you. But this is not an audition. And that too should make your staff members more comfortable. Part of the reason that I think of the word audition is that I'm thinking of that movie All About Eve, where, you know, Eve comes in and pretends to be a really helpful person to the superstar and then takes her place. That's not what you're going to let happen. All right, what do high skills volunteers need? The Big Mac: meaningful work, autonomy, and collegiality. Now, sometimes when I talk to nonprofit executives about meaningful work, They say it is not my job to give meaning to another person's life. That's not what we mean. We do not mean, satisfy everything that is not working in the person's life. We mean, as you see, important to the organization and allowing for the use of one's skills. And that can be everything from the really classic volunteer activities like planning a benefit event, the ladies who lunch. It's important to the organization because it raises money and it allows for the use of people's skills, whether those skills are picking the color of the tablecloth or calling up businesses and cajoling them into giving auction items. That's meaningful. And it is a very broad concept. In fact, not only should I say define skills broadly, I should say define meaningful broadly. Now, look at the projects. If you actually sat down and started scribbling projects you identified, take a look at them. I mean, are they meaningful? Do they advance your mission? Do they require some kind of skills? And then, as you see, the question is, how could you modify them to make them meaningful? Often you say to yourself, oh, I just need somebody to write the annual report. And it may be not obvious on the surface that the annual report advances your mission. But if you think about it, the function of the annual report is to let people who give you money know that their money has been well spent. So that absolutely advances your mission because it means that you'll get some more money. You can probably tell from all this that I spend a lot of time on the marketing and fundraising side of nonprofits and less time on the substantive side. So please forgive me if I'm not, talking about mission in terms of clients. Obviously, some of your projects will involve direct client contact, and then it will be clear that they advance your mission. On the other hand, in lots of nonprofit agencies, having a volunteer deal with clients is problematic. Volunteer workers who work with children, who work with people with disabilities, need to go through background checks and extensive training. This may not be the very best use of them. And particularly if dealing with clients requires skills of the kind that people with masters in social work have, if your volunteer worker doesn't have a master in social work, you're not going to want to do that. So that's why I keep talking about the sort of management side of your organization. But I think you can expand what I'm saying to the program side of your organization if that's appropriate to your group. So, do they advance your mission? Do they require the volunteer's skills? Certainly, if you want your annual report to be well written and you have a volunteer who is a retired journalist, that's a match made in heaven. And that's the kind of thought that needs to go into creating the M in Big Mac, which is meaningful work. The A in the Big Mac is autonomy. And this goes back to my idea that probably the best thing you can do is assemble teams of volunteers, even if teams are only 2 people, so that they can organize the work themselves. Now, obviously, you have timetables, and the volunteer workers need to understand what they are. They need to understand the goal of the project. But within that, just as you permit your staff to organize their own work, you need to permit your volunteers to do that. Otherwise, if they are micromanaged, they will feel devalued. Every now and then, somebody does research about what makes for satisfaction in a job, and they always find out that the people who have the least satisfaction are the ones whose activities are the most tightly controlled, who never get to say, I'm going to do that this afternoon because this morning I'm going to do X. who instead are told, okay, this morning you're going to do X and you're going to do it with, your hair on fire. Some very detailed kind of micromanagerial instruction. Those people are extremely dissatisfied in their work. Well, if you're paid and you need to keep your food on your children's table, you're going to put up with that. Volunteers are not going to put up with that. So particularly if your volunteers are being supervised by program substantive staff who don't necessarily have skills in supervision, although they may have skills in winning cases in the courts or, handling clients, you need to work with them to make sure they understand what they are supposed to contribute, stated goals and timetable, and what they are supposed to leave to the volunteer, and that is the opportunity to organize the work, autonomy. The C in Big Mac is collegiality or community. And this is something, I can feel you all kind of clenching your teeth, because during COVID-19, providing collegiality or community, even within your staff, has been extremely difficult. It's difficult to create a collegial atmosphere at a distance. It's difficult for people to get to know each other simply on Zoom or by phone calls. And it's not more difficult when the issue is having a volunteer leader and a volunteer team, but it's just as difficult. And yet it's just as important. Creating that team and the purpose of the volunteer leader is to let people know that they are not out there alone. I remember volunteering at an organization where the instruction that I got was go raise some money. That is not a thing that you can say to a person alone. And probably it's not a thing that you should say to a team either. But you might say to them, we need you to talk to every business manager on this 3-block stretch of businesses in our community. And to ask one person to do that is painful. They will feel lonely and frightened and not connected. But if there are 2 of them and one of them takes one side of the street and one of them takes the other side of the street and they report back to one another, or one of them takes the first 5 names in the phone book and the other one takes the second 5 names and they report to each other on Zoom or by telephone, then you have a team. Now, what can you do to contribute to that? Part of it is identifying a volunteer leader and putting multiple people at work with him or her. But another part of it is making sure that all your volunteer workers are oriented to the mission of your organization, that they understand how to talk about the organization to the outside world and to one another. The real function of the volunteer handbook is not to tell people where the bathroom is. It is to enable them to grasp the way you talk about yourself and what it is that you hope to be bringing to the community. It is very, very, very mission oriented. And again, from the standpoint of a volunteer worker, nothing is more important than mission. They're not getting paid. Mission is the key. The importance of in-jokes. I have organized groups of volunteers who needed to make phone calls. And every time one of them had a successful phone call, we would ring a bell. There was no particular reason to do that, except that it was our little in-joke. It was a way of feeling like a team. It was a way of connecting with one another. Everybody in the room knew that ringing a bell meant somebody had had some success. And these were people who didn't know each other, but after, the second time the bell rang, everybody's encouraging everybody else. There are all kinds of in-jokes in your workforce. Find out what they are and share them with your volunteers. So you're saying to yourself, oh my God, there is all this work that I am supposed to do, so I finally get something out of the volunteers. Well, yes, that is correct. But what you get, as you see, is enthusiastic and, for the most part, experienced help. That is to say, the overwhelming majority of your volunteers will be retired people, because retired people have time. And unlike younger people who don't have jobs, they usually don't need to be looking for jobs. So that is not trivial. I mean, you may see a lot of gray, or as the case may be, blue hair, but what you will find is people who have life experience and work experience who want to make sure your organization thrives. And that is not to be sneezed at. A second thing that you may not be thinking about is that your board of directors is charged with being your link to the community. But often your board is preoccupied with bringing the community's concerns to the organization, so that they sit at board meetings and they say, oh my God, we are not reaching those young men on the corner. We know that they're there. What can we do to reach them? And that is an extremely important board activity, to bring community concerns to the table. But you also need people who will reach out into the community and tell other members of the community what you're doing. And no one is as good a speaker on behalf of an organization as a volunteer, because they have decided that their valuable time could not be better spent than with you. And so they go out and they say, I was at Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic yesterday, and somebody suggested that we shouldn't read Huckleberry Finn. And we read Huckleberry Finn because blind people should have access to Huckleberry Finn. You can magnify this example in 9,000 directions. The truth of the matter is, volunteers talk about what they do because they're proud of what they do, and everybody they talk to knows more about your organization and thinks better of your organization because of that. That is, as they used to say on the MasterCard commercials, priceless. And speaking of priceless, you will also get a long-term loyal donor. Volunteers, as I said before, give more money than people who do not volunteer, and generally give it to the organizations where they volunteer. Now, I know there are some executive directors and fundraising directors who say, oh my God, we can't ask the volunteers for money. They're already giving us time. Yes, you can. Some of them will say no, that will be their privilege. Some of them will even take a little bit of umbrage if you ask them. But they're not going to quit a satisfying volunteer gig because you ask them for money. And many of them, knowing as they do how valuable your organization is, will give money and give it every year and encourage other people to give money. They are an incredible financial resource. And that's why I say that people who object to volunteers are objecting to $100 bills that are falling from the sky. All right, actionable steps. And by the way, I always hate the term actionable because I was trained as a lawyer, and in law, actionable means capable of being sued about. But that's not what we mean. We mean steps on which you can take action. So take your volunteer projects list, or if you haven't written one yet, write one, and then refine it to make sure that it is a set of activities that directly contribute to mission. If you have a volunteer coordinator, discuss that list with your volunteer coordinator, or if you are a volunteer coordinator, discuss that list with the executive director. Make sure everybody's on the same page. I know that often people treat the volunteer coordinator like, the person at the circus who's cleaning up after the elephants, but that's not the case. Your volunteer coordinator is the gateway to this incredibly valuable resource. Whatever he, or mostly she, does needs to be supported by the rest of the organization. The volunteer projects list should be discussed with the program staff, the people who deal with clients, at least in part to find out what they need done that they can't get done, but also to make sure they understand what the volunteer effort is all about. We are trying to make your life easier, program staff people. This is the list of ideas we came up with so that volunteer workers can make your life easier. What do you think? And then, and this is, I think, very important, choose one project on which to practice the new approach, because this is a new system for almost every agency. This is a new way of thinking about volunteers for almost every agency. Don't overload yourself. Volunteer projects need to be supervised, even if volunteer workers don't need to be micromanaged. So identify something very obvious and clear that everybody wants done. That's what I mean by supportive staff, that can be done in a finite period of time, like 3 months. In the next 3 months, we need to identify 25 donors from our old donor files that we should reach out to. Let's have volunteers do that analysis and then see how it goes. Now, many of you are probably thinking, yeah, Kel, but I don't actually have any volunteers. And that's what I mean by identify any recruitment needs. Clearly, you are not going to launch a volunteer project without volunteers. But it's easier to recruit volunteers who will do what you need to do and match the skills that you've identified as being necessary if you've already picked the project. At the same time, please, please, please do not go out and recruit volunteers when you don't have anything for them to do. You will lose them because people get the impulse to volunteer usually at a particular point in their retirement, and they want to do something now. So don't say to them, you know, we're so happy to have recruited you, we'll need you in 6 months. They won't be there. So figure out what you want volunteers to do and then go recruit them. Now, recruiting them is easier than you think. I became a long-term volunteer at Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic because I saw a classified ad that was 2 sentences long that said, Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic needs readers, call this number. People who are ready to volunteer will find you. You all know about the organizations that connect volunteers to one another, to organizations that need them, including what used to be called Business Volunteers for the Arts, but is now the Arts and Business Council, including the Executive Service Corps, which connects volunteer executives to agencies that need them, including civic organizations. Here in Chicago, there's a group, the name of which I can't at this moment remember, that does nothing but accept phone calls and texts from prospective volunteers and connect them to relevant organizations. Excuse me. So recruiting is the easy part of putting together a volunteer program. All right, key takeaways: projects, not tasks. That is, things that contribute to mission in an obvious way. The Big Mac, meaningful work, things that contribute to mission in an obvious way. Autonomy, that is freedom from micromanagement. And collegiality, the feeling that you're part of a team, whether that team is other volunteer workers or paid workers with whom the volunteer is working. And as you'll see, this is my, real takeaway, that volunteers do require effort. I can't pretend otherwise, but they do pay for themselves many times over. And that is all I have to say. If there are questions in the questions or comments or concerns, you can get in touch with me, or our hosts can let me know about them right now.
All right, Kelly, thank you. So we are a little bit over time, but we'll just ask Amber's question. And she asks, what would you suggest other than our mission in the volunteer handbook?
Oh, an organizational chart, very important. Let the volunteers know who's responsible for what. So when I say an organizational chart, I really mean a description of who's responsible for what. You know, not just this is the vice president for who's a frugate. So that volunteers understand how their work in one department connects to work in another department. In addition to that, I think, you know, a copy of the annual report so that they can see, you know, where you are and a little bit of where you've come from. Otherwise, the information in the volunteer handbook should be tailored to the particular volunteer project. You know, people who are working in fundraising need to know what's been done in fundraising. People who are working directly with clients need to know that our posture about clients is that we don't call them clients, we call them guests or whatever it might be. So it's really, you know, we call it the volunteer handbook, but it's really a kind of a written version of orientation to our culture at X agency.
All right, thank you, Kelly.
The pleasure was mine. I apologize to everybody for going over, but I get enthusiastic about the topic.
No worries. This workshop has come to a close. All materials and recordings will be available on our website. Thank you all so much for participating, and they're not a frill if you're using them right, how to save money and get more done using high school volunteers. And again, thank you, Kelly, for educating our community.
My pleasure.